Why Russia never put a man on the moon. The secret of the Soviet rocket. The period of the 50s and 60s was called the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union when things were difficult between them. Americans and Russians were allies in order to defeat Germany. This Cold War was an indirect war. There were no military confrontations, nor did they meet on battlefields. It came in 1961 when East German communities built the Berlin Wall with the aid of their Russian sponsors. The anti-fascist protection rampart wall, for many, was a barrier that intended to prevent East Germans from defecting to the West. In 1950, Korean War broke out between South Korea won the Americans against North Korean with the support of Russian and Chinese. The war ended in 1953, and it resulted in the partition of Koreans. Lands and Countries War was not the only Cold War between the two powers. Space race was another type of the U.S. and USSR conflict. There were a competition between the superpowers to discover and achieve technology to conquer outer space. When Neil Armstrong reached the moon as the first human to set foot on it in July 1969, the U.S. were celebrating the victory. On the other side, the Soviets were unhappy with the achievement since the one in the spacesuit was American and not a Russian. After the war, the intelligence officers of both Americans and Soviets grabbed as many as they could of German rockets experts so as to help them to be the most successful in the space race domain, because Germany have done great achievements during the Second World War when they developed V-2 rockets, which they attacked England with. Then they developed the V-2 that had a range of 200 miles, and it was able to carry 249 pounds of explosives. In 1955, Americans announced that they will launch a satellite into outer space soon. In August from the same year, Russians replied that they will launch one space satellite too. They could not let the whole propaganda to the U.S., so they must participate as well. This was the start of the space race. In October 1955, Soviet attained their first success in this domain when they launched the first satellite, Sputnik 1, into space, while Americans did nothing yet. That led the American President Eisenhower gave the men order to launch their first one as soon as possible. After the Russian Sputnik 1, and by December 6, 1951, U.S. launched their first satellite, Vanguard, to the outer space. The process was televised live, and millions were watching the incident. However, everything went wrong when the rocket exploded at a high of our feet. American embarrassment published in almost all the headlines of newspapers. It was an opportunity for Russia to swagger more, though they had their failure too. Russia confessed in 1989 that they failed in sending 3 probes to the moon, yet they were smarter because they have not done the process in front of millions of viewers. Therefore, no one could know about their unsuccessful operations, not as what was happened to the Americans. After the success of Sputnik 1, Russia launched Vatnik 1, which was the first spacecraft that carried the first human, Yuri Gagarin, 27 years, to the space into orbit around the Earth. He spent 108 minutes in the flight, then it landed safely on the Earth. The American astronaut told the BBC in 2011, "When he flew, my first impression was, well, they beat us again." He then went to the moon in 1972. On the other hand, the American President John F. Kennedy was astonished by the Vatnik 1. Before, he was not enthusiast for space exploration. If Kennedy could have opted out of a big space program without hurting the country in his judgment, he would have. Wisner said in John M. Longston's book, The Decision to Go to the Moon, especially that his administration experienced another failure after one day from the Vatnik success. When the U.S. president recognized the Soviets' exploitation from this success in space exploitation, he felt that he needed to have positive news about the U.S. that could overtake the Soviet. The Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson instructed Kennedy to report on the status of the U.S. space capability. They had two choices to rival Russia, either to develop a space station in orbit or to send a man in a mission to the moon, and they chose the second option. The beginning was with a speech by Kennedy to Congress in May 1961 in order to gain the people's support. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth, were Kennedy's stirring words. Now, America was committed to getting a man on the moon before the 1960s were over. In September 1963, surprisingly, Kennedy proposed that the U.S. and USSR should cooperate in the moon mission. However, Nikita Khrushchev refused this offer. The former was not able to continue this project due to his assassination in November 1963, and it was continued by President Johnson. During that time, Russians were doing their best to be on the forefront again, after launching new generation of rocket, Vatnik N1. The space race became the moon race. However, this time the Americans won the race. On July 16, 1969, and before Kennedy's deadline of putting the man on the moon before the end of the 60s, the American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin put their foot on the moon after 4 days from Saturn V rocket. Apollo soaring, finally Americans achieved something to be truly proud of. The Soviets made huge efforts in order to get to the moon first, but what have been happened and led them to lose the race? It was believed that Russians' major problem was that they were not able to develop a powerful rocket that could travel to the moon. By 1959, Soviets started their plan of the moon rocket. They concealed the schema for years before the actual development of the N-1 rocket in 1956, led by Sergei Korolev, who died in 1966. And that was another reason that obstructed the success of the operation. In addition to that, the American had already started developing their Saturn VR before 4 years. The Russian first prototype N-13L flew only 7 miles, then the engine caught fire and exploded. Then the N-14L that scrapped without launch. After that, they tried with N-15L that failed to take off. For N-16L, it blew up after 51 seconds from taking off. Then they had a last try with N-17L, which was able to reach 25 miles only. These failures were all secrets until the confession of the Russians in 1989. All the tries from 1969 to 1972 had failed. If Russians' project had succeeded, they might be the first to the moon. However, Americans won the moon race, and history listed Neil Armstrong,